Do you ever wonder what your therapist thinks about after hours? This is our chance to peel back the curtain and talk to your therapist, my wife, about what's on her mind. My name is Price, and I married your therapist.
Hello, my name is Ash, and I'm a licensed therapist. Please keep in mind that even though this is a podcast with a therapist and about therapy and mental health, it's not the same thing as therapy, and it's not a replacement for it.
I love how accurate this is because when I did my intro, I looked right into the camera.
And I did not make eye contact with the camera.
Because you have autism, and eye contact's just not your favorite.
It's not.
That's allowed. That's okay.
I make a lot of eye contact in sessions, to be fair.
Because you're a good therapist.
As much eye contact as you need.
Or none at all.
Or none at all.
Depending, right?
Depending.
So today, I don't want to talk about eye contact. I want to talk about the transgender community.
Yeah.
Specifically, the fact that you are a trans-affirming therapist and are, at least amongst our circles, becoming known as a therapist who really specializes in working with transgender individuals. Excuse me. I want to talk about what that means to you, how you kind of identified this community as somebody or a group of people that you really care about, and some of your observations of being a therapist that works with transgender people.
Absolutely.
The big disclaimer. Give us the disclaimer.
Yeah, neither one of us are trans. That I'm part of the LGBTQ plus community, but neither one of us have the experience of being transgender. And so all of this is about my work with transgender folks and our experiences with transgender people, but this isn't about our own experience.
And I think what we're going to consistently learn is that you're going to point us to trans people when we need to learn about trans people, right?
Yes,
Let's let the community speak for themselves.
Yeah, that is so important with any community that we're talking about. I think that it's been a mistake in the field of psychology in general and a lot of different fields, but I can speak for this one, that we've really leaned on experts to talk about everything. And it's really important to me as a therapist to be learning directly from people who are talking about their experiences.
Yeah. And here you're just here to talk about your experience and the things you have learned as a therapist in this space.
Yep, exactly. I think, it's taken us a few shots to get this episode right because we want to really express all of the love and care we have for this community and also be sure that we're staying within our own experience. So yeah, I think that we'll be able to do that.
We get all of our episodes perfect the first time. We've never re-recorded an episode. Or you
never ever. Ridiculous.
Yeah. So why don't we lay the ground floor here? Like let's establish a starting point.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be transgender?
Sure. So it's just a difference in gender expression. That gender is a social construct. It's the way we understand ourselves and our gender identity and the way that we want to be in relationship with others regarding gender. And it's different from sexuality.
I think that a lot of people would say, whoa. It's a social construct. Mm-hmm. I have a penis. I'm a man. There's nothing social about that. It's biological.
Yeah.
Right? I think a lot of people would and I'm speaking from my own experience. I used to think that way. I used to say that. And I don't think it's entirely, considering the world we live in, I don't think it's an entirely unreasonable conclusion to come to.
Sure.
If you're just thinking through these things on your own. So
what you're describing is sex and a sex characteristic, which is what genitals are. But even that, and we won't get into this because I'm not a biologist, but even that is much more complicated and much more nuanced than we've made it out to be. That even those sex characteristics that we like to think of as either or really exist all the way across a spectrum, and that there's a lot more variation there than I think that sometimes we've given that credit for.
So to be trans, it's just a difference in gender expression.
Yep. So then gender is the social part of that. And the reason that I say it's something that's a social construct, is that like our dog Connie doesn't have a gender expression. She just exists as a dog. And people, we express our gender, and our gender has been expressed differently over time. And I think that we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on, but the way that we have described masculinity and femininity and that sort of thing has really changed over time and by culture, and it's a thing that we perform. It's something that we kind of put on.
So the cultural part is like, I'm a boy, so these are the types of clothes that I wear. These are the types of things I am interested in. Yeah. These are the types of behaviors that are acceptable for me to demonstrate to the world. Like, I am a boy, so I act like this. You are a girl, so you act like this. That's just a social idea. There's nothing biological about that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But then even the biology is more complicated than we've given it credit for. So really across the board, I think we've just had a poor understanding of gender and sex. And
well, I see a lot of people.
Somebody who has.
I'm sorry.
So somebody who has differences there. So the two different terms that we'll kind of talk about are being cisgender or transgender. And cis just means on the same side as. So the sex that you were assigned at birth, that feels like the right fit for you. You're cisgender on the same side as that.
Yeah.
And then trans means across. So like transatlantic, across the Atlantic. Excuse me. And trans just means across from that in some way. So maybe you're still within that binary system. And if you were born and a doctor said that you were a male, you identify as a woman, or vice versa. Or maybe you don't really associate with the binary system at all, and you
don't feel well represented by either one of those titles, right?
Right. Non-binary, gender non-conforming, agender, one of those terms that means that you're either somewhere along that spectrum or feel outside of that.
Okay. So we live in a binary world where you're either a man or a woman, and that's not necessarily reflective of our biology. Mm-hmm. And you said you're not going to dive as into that because you're not a biologist, but like it's very.
But even our chromosomes aren't exactly either or. Our hormones aren't really either or. And our genitals and our sex characteristics and height and all of those things that we kind of describe as fitting into one category or the other, it's really much more complicated.
Well, it's interesting you say that because a lot of people, I see this sort of comment online all the time where someone says, it's third grade biology. You need a man and you need a woman in order to procreate. And why is this more complicated? Why are we making it more complicated than this? This is third grade biology. But here you're telling me it's not just third grade biology or that. Sure, that's the third grade understanding of biology, right?
But it's a very simplistic understanding of it.
We need to graduate to middle school and to high school on these ideas.
We need to move on. That it's a simple way that we try to divide up things as either or, but that life is so much more complicated than that. And we see all throughout, the natural world and the animal kingdom, of which we're a part of, that there are lots of differences in gender. And we say that this is something that's unnatural, but it's the most natural thing in the world. So many species have more than two genders. So many species have, animals that will change across gender, that have differences in the way that they carry babies. Seahorses, for example, most people know that like male seahorses carry babies, and it's so much more complicated and beautiful than that. And it's really sad to get to humans who are actually able to have gender expression, who are able to talk about and comprehend and understand our gender,
right,
and relate to other people that way. And we go, nope, it's either or.
Where we really limit ourselves and our species to you're either a male or you're either a woman.
Yep.
And again, not reflective of biology and not reflective of like how humans want to behave or see themselves.
Yeah, the complexity of just being human. But somebody who's trans really just has a difference in the way that they experience their gender. And I think that a lot of cis people will say, that the confusion around that comes from, one, perhaps not having ever questioned that themselves, but also will come from just not having a difference in that. And I can say from being a part of the community that has sexual differences, it is so hard for me to imagine a lived experience outside of being bisexual. That
Right.
in fact, a lot, and we talked about it in the other episode, but a lot of me not coming to terms with that early on was just because I thought everybody was that way.
You thought everybody was bisexual.
Exactly. And the trans people that I know who are talking about their experiences, they weren't realizing early on that everybody wasn't having these differences. And then when they were, they realized that they needed to shut up about it because it wasn't safe. But that these differences were happening all along.
So your
and go down
trans
to the
clients
core
are
of
like,
who they are.
early on as they're coming of age, they're thinking everybody has these sorts of identity questions where a lot of us don't.
Yeah, they'll be asking their friends, do you ever wonder what it would be like to be a girl? Do you ever wish that you were a girl? And it's when they're meeting that shock from their friends that they're
No.
like, oh, yeah.
No, I haven't.
But for instance, if you're growing up trans, there's a good chance that you're watching puberty come down the road and you're feeling very fearful of those differences. You don't want to experience those changes that are going to really differentiate you.
Yeah.
And you're feeling fear around that. Or you're hoping that maybe puberty goes different for you, that it doesn't hit, or that it hits. And
Well, I
it's
mean, I
different.
remember looking like so excited for the deeper voice and the facial hair. Like, yes,
Yes.
that's me. I'm a
Yes.
man. I want to be those. I want to have those characteristics.
And that's a very cis experience.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I was sharing. This person is a friend, and that's what I was sharing is like, I was excited about puberty. That as much as puberty is like a time that as adults we all talk back on like, oh my gosh, what a terrible experience. It's really difficult. What an awkward time. We were excited. I wanted to be a woman. I wanted those changes to happen. And this person was surprised because those changes were really fearful.
It's difficult to imagine not, like receiving that with open arms. You know, being like, oh, this is going to take me further away from the person I see myself as or who I want to identify as. You know.
That these inevitable changes are coming down the road. But yeah, just know that their experience down to the core is really impacted by those sorts of things. And just as much as it was real for you to get excited about getting a deeper voice,
Right.
that fear and dread a lot of the times that's present, not always present, but a lot of the time present, the same sort of, deep to the core of who they are.
Right.
This won't be me.
So you mentioned kind of the difference between gender identity and sexuality. You know, it's interesting to me, and this is one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the past, I would say, year and a half, is that while the T in LGBTQ stands for transgender, being trans has very little in common with being gay or being lesbian or being...
Yeah, and in fact, you could be both.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so for the longest time, I thought that was all just like the same group of people, that trans just are a part of that. And what I've learned is that there's really not much in common between those groups.
It's a very separate category. One is talking about sexuality, so differences in attraction, and one is talking about gender identity.
Yeah, so one is like who I want to have sex with or be in a relationship with. So if I'm gay, that means I identify as a man and I want to be in a relationship or have sex with, or I find other men attractive. Whereas trans has nothing to do with how you view other people.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with attraction.
Yeah, it's solely how you identify yourself.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I think that's a really important distinction, especially for people like me who are learning about these topics,
And it's really been lumped in that way, even though it is a different category, even though it is talking about a different part of human experience. Because early on, the people who were researching differences in gender were viewing it as a sexual perversion. And still there's a lot of stuff about transgender identity today that is impacted by these outdated beliefs that we now know to be incredibly false and harmful. But it really impacted having them lumped in that community. And then, of course, you can't talk about the LGBTQ plus community without acknowledging that trans people, trans women, and specifically trans women of color have really led the way for LGBTQ plus rights across the board. And we're always the last ones to receive any benefit from, the blood, sweat, and tears that were poured into that.
Yeah. Yeah, the little research I've done on the history of the LGBTQ movement definitely shows that Black trans women were at the forefront of those battles.
Yep.
And those protests and those fights, and
Yeah.
are some of the most oppressed members of that group even today.
Yep. Sometimes even ostracized within the community itself.
So let's talking about the erasure of trans folks. Let's touch on what I think is probably the most important aspect of this conversation for somebody who's really the biggest game changer for me. Mm-hmm. This is what really helped me kind of rationalize and understand what we're talking about here.
Okay.
Because I was born in a world where you're either born a man and you're attracted to women, or you're born a woman and you're attracted to men.
Right.
What's the word for that again?
Oh, heteronormativity.
Yes.
Yep.
That's a big word.
It's a big word. I'm glad I got it out all in one piece
You
this
did.
time.
It was beautiful. So that's the world I was raised in. So going from that perspective to understanding like the place that trans people have in our society, in our world, and in our friend group even, me understanding how erased they have been from history.
Yes.
Has really helped me wrap my mind around this topic.
Yeah.
So walk me through, we're not historians.
Yep.
That's not the point of this podcast, but at a high level, walk me through how we have kind of systemically erased this group of people from our culture.
Absolutely.
I mean, they were still there, like they still exist, but we have erased like acknowledging them and giving them room.
Yes.
So walk me through that.
Yeah, it's so much a part of the narrative that this is new and different, or that this hasn't always been a part.
I hear that all the
history.
time. There's so many more trans people now, or so many more, LGBTQ people now.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why does it feel that way to some people?
Well, exactly because of what you said, trans people have been categorically erased from history. So if we do remember the things that they've contributed to history, their writings and their research and their, role in society, we have taken away their identity to do that. But most of the time we've erased them completely. We've attributed their accomplishments to somebody else who came along at a different time.
Yeah.
And we've kind of written them out, and that happens all across the board.
But I've even heard that this has its roots in it has a weird equality with, or weird parallel with racism as well, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely tied to racism. So erasure of trans people has to do with, it has a lot of roots in colonialism. So as white European settlers, first of all, had this hierarchy between men and women where men are at the top and women are beneath them. And to be able to do that, it's about power and control, as a lot of things are. You have to be able to tell who's a man and who's a woman. So making sure that those roles were very clearly defined. When naturally, I think that anybody listening to this would know from their lived experience that those experiences as men and women really, really vary. That lots of little girls do certain little girl things, but a lot of little girls are out playing with the boys. They love sports. They don't care about, the things that we attribute to being feminine. And
there are a lot of little boys who like to do more feminine, play and
exactly.
And then that's true for like men and women as they grow up as well. If they're really given full license to just be who they are authentically,
right.
You have a full range of human beings out there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That even, let's say like your grandfather, who I think a lot of people would categorize as like a man's man, who's very, traditionally masculine and chopping wood and doing all that stuff. Loved caring for small animals and was very tender and liked to...
He was a gardener. He loved flowers.
Yeah, liked to read and collected the, beautiful dolls and, did all of those things and cared about them because our experience is so much more varied than that.
Yeah.
I've now gotten way off topic. Okay, we're talking about colonialism. So really it has its roots there, because if the white European colonizers have this division so that we can tell men are this and women are this, so that we know who to oppress, we know who to stick at the bottom of that hierarchy.
Right.
They're coming into these other cultures, and all over the world, trans people existed, that so many other cultures celebrated a third gender, or had gender fluidity, or had people who, would cross over genders, or embodied,
Right.
being both masculine and feminine. A lot of times they were viewed as especially holy, as especially like blessed.
You're talking about India, Africa, South America, North America,
Yeah.
that a lot of these indigenous groups honored and revered
Yeah.
people who were not non-binary, right? That there was
Yeah.
room for them in their cultures,
Absolutely.
that these people existed and thrived and were honored.
Yep. In
Yeah.
Hinduism, there are, gods that embodied a third gender, or who had gender fluidity. That this existed all over the world, all throughout time, and that it was colonialism coming in and trying to separate themselves from these other cultures, and saying that we're superior to them because we have such a division between genders.
Yeah. That is one of the many things that makes us superior to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, making the claim that what makes us superior to you is that we do distinguish between genders and you don't.
Right.
And so where there were other cultures that had more of this crossover, which again, natural and has been occurring forever,
Right.
it was those differences that were pointed out as barbaric.
So we erased this idea, but what didn't change is that people are born who don't really fit into one of these two baskets that this culture created.
So here, of course, now time is moving on, and trans people still exist as they have always existed.
Right.
But there's this story now that, like, oh, that's not a thing that is supposed to happen.
If you equate like all of human history to a year, we have been calling the human experience binary in terms of gender, male and female, for the past 5 minutes.
Yeah, for such a short period of time.
So for somebody who's like, it's unnatural for you to be trans, is really only talking about the last few hundred years of human history.
Yeah.
Because before that, there was absolutely, for most humans,
Yep.
an acceptance that there were people who didn't fall into one of those
buckets. And there's
buckets.
been a slow progression of these things over the years that, the Victorian era distinguished certain things that were especially feminine and especially masculine, and continued to separate those things.
Well, let's talk about the Victorian era for a second, because the manliest men wore full wigs, wore full faces of, wore full faces of makeup, and these ridiculous pompous outfits that make them look like...
era? I think that we might be off. But exactly, that even in white European history...
Yeah.
You see things being considered extremely masculine, such as wearing heels, wearing wigs, wearing full faces of makeup, being poets, being writers, being soft and gentle.
Yeah.
And that those things have, of course, changed drastically over time, not only amongst cultures all over the world, but even in this like one white European lineage. Yeah, it's looked extremely different over time. That things that, now people say back when men were men, like when there were heels, like what are you talking about?
Right.
What period of time are you pointing to?
I know that, don't quote me on this, but I think it was like in the 20s or 30s, pink was still a masculine color. It was a male color.
Yeah.
And it's only more in recent years that pink has become like a woman or female color. So even these things that like define gender roles now, our grandparents, our great grandparents had a different experience with those things. And so it's like we're constantly changing. So it's like you're a girl, so you like pink. That's just an idea.
Brand new.
We just came up with that. We just made that up. There's
exactly.
nothing like inherently feminine about a color.
Yes.
Or a article of clothing.
And that always to say that there's a distinct divide and you can tell is about being able to point out who you're supposed to be in control of, is about being able to create this hierarchy, because our lived experiences point to the fact that, not only have these things changed over time drastically, but also even amongst, cisgender people, it means very different things to be a man or to be a woman.
Right.
That there is many different ways to be a woman as there are women. And, even the women in my life who I would say I have a lot in common with across this whole like spectrum of possible identity, we're very different in the way that we put on our womanhood and the way that we connect with that.
Right. Man. See, that's been the biggest learning for me is like, oh, they've been around this whole time.
Yeah.
This isn't new. This isn't like
Mm-hmm.
the modern world gone awry. This is, humanity reclaiming its own space.
Yes.
And standing up against a system that is like explicitly oppressive towards people who don't fit into these molds, right?
Yes, and the fact that trans and non-binary people exist and are having to carve out this space for themselves gives everybody more space to understand themselves and their own gender.
So what do you like about this community? Because we've really talked about who they are and why they exist, but what you are specifically, because as a therapist, you could identify any demographic that you really wanted to work with, and you could pursue those sorts of clients, right? But you are out here really interested and loving the work that you get to do with trans clients.
Yep.
Why is that? Why do you like them?
Well, kind of going back to carving out that space and how that impacts all of us, it is so good to be asking these questions of ourselves. And I love getting to work with clients who are doing the work of digging in and asking what makes them who they are, what they want to do with what was handed to them as part of this like social narrative, and how they actually want to live and be authentic. I find that work so exciting with all of my clients. I got into working with the trans community because I was just working with the LGBTQ plus community in general.
Right.
Then started having trans clients come in. And at this point, I knew a good bit about the trans community, but I didn't have a lot of maybe like personal lived experience, or at least not
hands-on experience as
in a client setting.
Yeah.
Exactly. And wow, these are people who are really asking those questions, and getting to dive into those things in a counseling space is so exciting, and I think so important for everybody across the board. But
they're really having to get into it. And to be trans means by definition that you're having to ask yourself some pretty serious questions about who you are on a fundamental level.
And that it is costly to do those things.
Yes.
That it is coming at the expense a lot of the times of their relationships with their family.
Yeah.
We're in a very small rural community, and it's a dangerous place to be trans.
Yes, it is.
And that these people are still willing to ask themselves these questions, on one hand because you can't help to. It's part of their lived experience. And on the other hand, to like live these things out, even if it's just in the private space of our sessions.
I mean, I am meeting people who are just straight up oppressed right now because they don't totally look the part of the gender that they're dressing as.
Yeah.
Right? And they're having people, like, if they're walking on the sidewalk, they're having people roll down their windows and throw things from their cars at them, yelling a slur. Mm-hmm. They're getting physically attacked. Yeah. Like they have colleagues and coworkers or classmates like mocking them openly.
And then even just on a daily basis, when it's not something that horrendous, having people misgender them, having people use the wrong pronouns.
No, it's not a fad. It's not for fun. It's not to get attention. These people are out here suffering.
Yeah.
And they don't have another option. They have to identify as the gender they identify as. Mm-hmm. And their life is not better for it in terms of the way they're treated. Right.
In terms of just their ability to easily walk into the grocery store and go about their lives. Yeah. That there is, again, a lot of cost associated with that. Yeah. Certainly in their lived experiences, they're sharing that their world and their life is so much better for this. But it is associated with a lot of trauma and a lot of harm that's being done to them.
So what are some commonalities that you see amongst your trans clients? What are some things that you're really getting into them, in with them about.
Yeah. So first of all, it's important to understand that just as the LGBTQ plus community isn't all just one thing, that the trans community isn't a monolith. It's not all the same person with the same lived experience.
Right.
That there is such a diversity amongst the trans community. But so we're talking about the things that I'm talking about with everybody, that, you know, it's just human experiences. We're talking about anxiety and depression and family stuff and relationships and homework and, you know, everything that humans talk about. But there are a couple of things that come up a lot. So apart from exploring identity, in all aspects of identity, because they're not just talking about gender, they're talking about why am I who I am and what does it mean to be me, because that's what those identity questions always get down to.
Right. Who am I?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Who am I and how do I connect with others? We're talking a lot about trauma, a lot about family trauma, religious trauma. So that's going to open up into talking about finding and connecting with community, talking about engaging in relationships.
Because a lot of these people are getting kicked out of their homes, getting kicked out of their churches.
Yeah. Or just suffering harm in their homes or in those spaces that they're trying to exist in. What else? Talking about finding safe spaces, living in a world, coping in a world that isn't always safe. Yeah.
They're living in a world that feels like it's growing in its animosity towards the transgender community as a whole.
It has been so scary, the legislation in the past couple of years that has just, been out in full force.
Yeah.
In harmful ways against trans people.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that for a second, because I think that you see this narrative that's driving a lot of this legislation that trans people are, and this is the word I hear all the time, they're grooming kids. Mm-hmm. Interesting side note, in my world as a project manager, we used to use the term grooming to talk about grooming a user story, taking for software development, taking like a piece of information and raking through it and making sure that it's what it needs to be. And the project management group of professionals came out with a statement saying we're not calling that grooming anymore because grooming has taken on such a different and negative tone. This was last year. This was recent. So it's so prevalent, this terminology, that it's actually changed. It's actually impacting other things that has nothing to do with it.
Absolutely.
So, you know.
So something that we see happening again and again is that a word will be used. A word is starting to either be reclaimed by a community, or in this case with grooming, we're starting to talk about an issue. So a few years ago, I was working at a sexual assault resource center and in a center dealing with child abuse specifically. So we're talking a lot about grooming in that context. Grooming is when a predator will essentially lay the groundwork so that they're allowed to have this place in a child's life, so that the child trusts them, the parents trust them, and that sort of thing. And it's this long, slow, intentional process of harm to lay the foundation so that they can carry out abuse without being suspect. But as we start talking about those things, and so while I was there, this was being talked about more and more socially, and it was amazing. It was great that we were talking more and more about that, and that more and more people were learning these terms and understanding what grooming meant. A lot of that went hand in hand with the Me Too movement, that we were also starting to talk about these things happen to children, and we're teaching people words like grooming. It's important to know what grooming is, because grooming looks very nice on its surface. It's the process of, again, befriending and building trust.
Yeah, ingratiating yourself with a family.
Exactly. Yeah. It looks very pleasant. And so it was good that people were learning this term. But what we see again and again is that when a term like that is coming out and being part of public discourse, that at some point it's going to be co-opted and misused.
Right.
So a couple years following finally talking about that in a public way, now there are people using that word to point out things that they feel uncomfortable with and intentionally mislabeling them. Interestingly, a bit of a grooming process to like convince the public that something is what it is not. And so then grooming started to be applied to the trans community, when the trans community, once again, it's nothing to do with sexuality or attraction, really is about a difference in gender. And the reason that we're focusing on trans kids is because trans kids are so at risk for death, for suicide, for bullying, for depression, for anxiety, for all of these things that carry into adulthood.
Right.
And so the trans community is, in the LGBTQ plus community at large, is interested in talking about children because children are at risk. They don't have the autonomy that adults have. They can't separate themselves from a harmful or abusive family who doesn't accept or acknowledge their identity. And they're at their mercy. But just talking about kids in general, now that term is getting co-opted and applied to the trans community as though they're there's a perversion there.
Like they're deliberately trying to cause harm. Well, I think that a lot of people would say, you know, how could a kid be trans? How could a kid know that they're not the gender they were born as?
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. You
right.
know?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That's such an important question. And it's a valid question. Like, I wanted to be a cat when I was 3. Why do kids still maybe should have hung on to that dream? I think it's a good one. But, yeah, why are we talking about gender with 3-year-olds? Shouldn't somebody be saying that when they're an adult or later in their teenage years? Come on, Trouble. Okay. Why are we talking about this with children? So what's really important to know is that gender identity starts to be formed around the ages of 3 to 5. That naturally in child development, children are starting to understand what gender is and their relationship with it between about the ages of 3 to 5. It's a developmentally appropriate time for that conversation to be happening. So yeah, that's the first time that we're hearing with trans kids that we've misidentified their gender, and they're starting to go to their parents and say, I'm not a little boy, I'm a little girl. And
I think that there's that narrative, we don't want to acknowledge it, but that narrative exists in our culture where it's very common that a little boy will want to play with dolls. Mm-hmm. And identify, like, do things that identify as a little girl, and their parents are like, no, you play with these toys, you know, because you're a boy, or vice versa. And that, like, we all know that happens. That either happened to us or to a family member or to a friend, or we see it represented in the media. Like, we accept that happens.
That those are the ages that's happening around. And
yeah. And if you can also accept that gender is just like a social construct, then let your kid tell you what gender they are. It's not like, does it hurt? Does it hurt your kid?
Absolutely not. So a couple of other things about that. That is just developmentally the age that we are starting to have an understanding of our own gender. So it tends to be the time that these kids are starting to express their gender differences. But yeah, there's also the concern, does that mean that little kids are having surgery? Does that mean, what does it mean when we say we're allowing kids to transition? Well, at that age, a transition is always a social transition. It just means affirming the things that they like, letting a kiddo grow their hair out or play with the toys that are affirming to them that they enjoy playing with, and playing with the friends that they enjoy playing with.
Right.
Just the things that in general are really healthy for child development.
So you mean to tell me that we're not giving these kids hormones?
Yeah.
We're not putting them through surgeries that forever alter their appearances?
No, absolutely not. So hormone blockers are what we're talking about, and kids aren't receiving hormone blockers until they start to hit puberty and are dealing with hormones and the consequences of puberty, and going through a puberty that doesn't align with who they are. So this is years down the road. The only thing that's happening with little kiddos is that absolutely they're old enough to start identifying their gender. It's the age that is happening.
Right.
And we're allowing them to socially do the things that they want to do, which is just healthy for kids anyway.
So if I'm a parent and I have a kid who's claiming that their gender is different than what I think their gender is, I shouldn't be freaking out.
Yeah. So research is showing again and again and again that kids that the thing that kids are traumatized by is not having their parent believe them, not having their parent accept them as they are and who they're sharing that they are. These differences tend to last over time, but even in the rare cases where maybe a kiddo is saying that something is true and down the road they're like, that's not quite right about me, that they're not traumatized by a parent who is affirming, even if
In
they end
support
up
of them
growing
the
up
whole way. Yeah.
exactly and being cisgender.
So
That's not a traumatizing experience. What is denying them their
So
identity.
the worst action that I could take as a parent is to insist my idea of my kid's gender and force that on them.
Exactly. That it's absolutely safe to do that. That's what's going to allow your kiddo
To
to get to
accept
grow
them.
up.
Yeah.
To get to grow up healthy, and that even if there are changes down the road, that it won't have caused them any harm, and also the technical steps that we're taking at that age. Absolutely nothing is permanent. It's just a social transition. And down the road, puberty blockers are just putting off puberty.
Right.
If you come off of puberty blockers, you'll continue having the puberty that you were going to have. So it can be delayed and happen down the road, and your kiddo is not going to be harmed. But yeah, as a parent, not only are you absolutely safe to accept your kid for who they say that they are, it's the only way to help keep your kid from having the anxiety, the depression, the suicidal ideation, and the other things that are so much more common with trans kids who aren't affirmed in their identity. And that it's not our job as parents to tell our kids who they are in so many regards. But we just get to pick the role that we play in our life. And if we're a safe person for them, and you get to be a safe person for them by learning alongside them.
Right.
The other thing that can be difficult is that some parents get so excited to jump in and support their kid or feel so much pressure to do so. Kids need time to figure out who they are. So even though kids at 3 to 5 are starting to figure out their identity, this doesn't mean that your whole world is going to turn upside down. This is going to be a slow process of self-discovery.
Yeah.
You can let your kid take their time.
Yeah. And it could really just be that simple. It could be, Mommy, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. Like, okay.
Okay.
Whatever. You're 3. Okay.
Yeah.
Good luck with that. Figure it out and come back to me.
But
you know?
saying no and try to correct not only is not effective and isn't going to change something about your kid.
It's not going to make them not trans, right?
Yep. It's just going to let them know that you're not a safe person in their life.
And they're going to have to
Which is
bury
very dangerous.
this thing
Yeah.
deep.
Yeah.
And as you're uncovering with your clients, that causes a lot of damage.
It causes a lot of damage that down the road they're not a different person for that. They've just now gone through a puberty that wasn't theirs to go through and has been harmful for them. And they've done it alone. And they have had to have a whole aspect of their identity down to their core that like their parents never got to delight in and to know.
And one of the biggest things that as I kind of grew in my acceptance of my own acceptance of the trans community, one of the things I really struggled with was like, if you are born male or identified as male, and then you discover that you want to be identified as a female, why can't you just be a male that likes female things?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm realizing that that's what would have happened in a more like an indigenous ancient culture, where you could just be the thing that you were born as and you weren't labeled a specific thing. You could just exist as the human that you were, and there wasn't societal pressures to act one way or another depending on what was in between your legs, right?
That's the thing, is that one, absolutely you can be a boy who just likes more traditionally feminine things.
Yeah.
That doesn't make you transgender. That makes you a boy who likes the thing that you like.
Yeah.
Like that is separate from gender identity. It is not fulfilling.
Of course. Yeah, I'm not trying to say that.
Oh, no, I know you're not.
Okay.
I'm just saying that's not the same thing. Your kid's not going to be like, oh, thanks, I just didn't realize I could play with dolls. Like, that's not what's actually happening. It's something about their identity, the core of who they are. That's not going to fulfill that need.
We live in a hyper-gendered world.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that asking that question forces us to create this pretend scenario where gender doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That this person suddenly can live in a world where we don't care about those things, where you can just be called a boy who likes girlish things and be treated. No, absolutely not. We live in a very binary society, and it does mean something to identify one way or the other. It does have repercussions, and that, yeah, in a society where we're just open to and affirming of everybody's gender, sure, you could do that. You could just be Price, who likes this and who does this and who participates in these things.
Right.
But we do live in a world where gender matters because we've made it matter. And so it matters that people get to identify the way that is affirming to them.
Yeah, and there's no there's no changing that. That's just the way the world is, and that's the world we live in.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't get to ask the person around you to now exist in this pretend world where those things don't matter. It just does.
Yeah.
It just is the world that we live in. It is our culture. And so identity and being able to live openly with that identity, like, that matters.
So if we're listening to this conversation and we think that maybe we're trans, or we know we're trans, or maybe we're just not non-binary, we have some questions about our gender.
Yeah, we're figuring it out.
What's your recommendation? What should we do?
A couple of things are important. It's going to be important to find a community and to learn about those experiences from other people with lived trans experience. So one place that I love for that is this Facebook group, and they also have a Discord channel that you can find through the Facebook group, but it's called So You Might Want to Learn More About Trans People.
Yes.
It's a space by Evie Winters, who is a trans woman, and it is so conducive to asking questions without already having to nail the vocabulary, without already knowing the right answer.
Right.
That if you ask a question in good faith, whether you're cis or trans or questioning or anywhere in between, that your question is going to be taken seriously and answered by tons of people who actually have lived experience with the thing that you're talking about.
Right.
It's an amazing, accepting, affirming place. So that's a place that I recommend to anybody with questions. But if you're trans and you're trying to figure it out and get connected with other people, you need a community who believes and supports you. That's a great place to do it. But there are plenty of other spaces like that are good.
Right.
The other thing is that it's great to have a trans affirming counselor. Therapy, I think, is really important in general if you can have access to it. But what I want people to know that you might not know about therapy is that not every therapist is experienced in this space. Not every therapist is educated in this space.
Not every therapist is affirming.
Not every therapist is affirming. So it's really, really important that if you're seeking out a therapist, that you're making sure it's somebody who is affirming of the LGBTQ plus community and specifically trans folks. Because there are so many therapists out there also causing harm who don't know about this, who are telling their clients, can't you just be a boy who likes girly stuff, or whatever, who are denying people their lived experience. And so you need to make sure that you're with somebody who is actually affirming and educated. There are lots of us out there, will be easy to find, but it's not every therapist, so that's important.
Okay. And if we care about somebody who's trans or love somebody that's trans, I'm guessing some of the same things apply, right? Yeah. Especially finding these communities online where we can ask questions.
Yes, that it's not your trans friend, family member, whatever's job to be your primary educator.
Yeah.
They're figuring out their own experiences.
Yeah.
And maybe they do love talking about it and would love to answer questions, but it's not the job of the person in front of you with an identity to now become your primary source of education. So go to these same spaces, So You Might Want to Learn More About Trans People, and learn about this from trans people who want to put in the work, who want to give that education,
right,
who have the bandwidth to talk about it. Believe the people around you. It is safe to believe people about their own experiences. And yeah, that you can do a lot of good just by being present and believing who people are and what they say about themselves.
And if we're cisgendered, what are ways that we can, because it's really difficult to wrap your head around what it must be like to be non-binary or trans. You know, it has been for me, for sure. And it's taken a lot of education, and for me, getting to meet people who are trans, like in real life. So what sort of steps could we take to be more, I don't know, show more love to this community, more support, and to really build our understanding of what it's like to be trans?
Yep. It's really, again, important to be learning from people who have lived experience. It's helpful for you to take the time to ask yourself these questions about your own identity. I think as cis people, we often don't ask ourselves questions about our gender. And I know, you know, just from your experience and my experience, our lives are so much better for having questioned these things in ourselves and thinking about them, regardless of the answer you come to.
And the questions that come up aren't just about gender identity, but also just like, what kind of person am I? I'm so emboldened to really evaluate who I am in a different way because of the people in my life who have asked that question and come up with challenging answers. You know, like answers that are life-changing, right?
Yes, absolutely. That, you know, any identity question is now getting down to the core of who we are and how we relate to others, which is what it means to be human. And it's good to know those things about ourselves.
And I think that this is diminutive. Is that the right word? Diminutive? I think that this is maybe not the best all-encompassing example, but one thing that has really changed my perspective on this is asking myself, if I was born into a different body tomorrow, not my own body, the body that I
woke up and were born
I'm sorry,
in a
that's
different body.
if I woke up in a different body, potentially like a female body, I would not all of a sudden imagine that I was a woman who liked masculine things. I would be in the wrong body. I would be aware that I was in the wrong body.
You would still feel like you, who down to your core feel like a man, and that it doesn't have to do with the body parts that you had. And if you woke up in a different body tomorrow, you'd be like, I'm in a body that is not affirming to me, that doesn't express out to the world who I am and how I feel about myself. Now, just a really short bit of education about why that isn't. It's a good starting place, I think a good entry point for cis people who have a hard time imagining what that would be like.
Right.
If I woke up tomorrow in a body with a penis, that penis wouldn't make me wouldn't make me a man. I'd be like, this isn't who I am. I'm a woman who has a penis. It's a good entry, a good maybe like thought process into that. But it's important to know that it's not always helpful to understand trans people as just being born in the wrong body. That for a long time we've made part of being trans, part of the process for talking about that include dysphoria, which is this feeling of having something about your body, something about your voice, something about this external expression be wrong. And not every trans person actually has that. Right. Some people just know that what would be affirming to them, what would be more right for them, what would allow them to live their best life and to relate to people they want to relate to them in the way that they want to relate to them, and all of that would be to have differences, but not that they have to have that sense of dysphoria of feeling like it's wrong. So it's important that that does not encompass all trans experiences. But yeah, I think as a cis person, that thought process is a helpful one. If I woke up in a different body tomorrow, that wouldn't immediately change my gender. I'd go, this is wrong for me.
Right.
This doesn't feel right. Another part of that is that not all, and I don't even think most trans people end up either taking or having access to hormones or to surgery. So, and their experiences are just as valid as somebody who has decided to do those things or has had access to those things. But yeah, what makes you you? What are the things to you that affirm your gender? And it goes so much deeper than just the body that we were born in. And then it's good to ask those questions.
So if we're listening, if you're listening and you're trans or kind of asking those questions, I want to personally say that I think that you're pretty badass
Yeah.
for really having to dig into that yourself and really question those things in a world that feels pretty hostile.
That you didn't pick having to ask those questions, but
Yeah.
the world is a better, more beautiful place for you being bold enough to ask those questions in a world that would like you not to.
And you're not strange or different. That this is the most natural thing in the world. And
You're
the
not
idea,
broken.
yeah, and the idea that you're broken or abnormal is a very modern idea that has its roots in power and control, not in this is how human bodies work and this is how human beings work in the way that we express ourselves.
Yep. And you're not alone.
Yeah.
That if your family doesn't accept you or your community doesn't, that that this community is so beautiful. Again, it's a group of people asking these questions, these really important questions, that this community is so beautiful and so rich and such a soft landing place for you.
Yeah.
And that good things exist here.
And if you're listening and you're cis and you're worried about somebody who's asking those questions, it's none of your business at the end of the day.
Yeah, that we are so concerned with how other people live their lives, again, without asking these questions of ourselves, and that's the place to start with. And a lot of times what we're bothered by in this community and other people, in fact, in a lot of different communities that are oppressed, are the parts of ourselves that we can't accept. You know, for the longest time, I struggled with my own sense of like girlhood or womanhood because I didn't always feel like I related to other girls, that I didn't feel like I did some things that other girls did naturally.
Right.
Which again is kind of an assumption that all of those things can be natural, but that I didn't fit into this box, and that it's easy to then look at somebody who's living outside of this very binary black and white system and to resent that. And
Right.
that often when we're looking at somebody else and hating them, that like a good place to start is, what has this cost me?
Yeah.
Where have I been harmed by a binary system? Where am I being impacted by this? And what part of that am I now taking out on somebody else? When, like you said, it's none of my fucking business. And that we're all better off for being willing to then turn that question on ourselves.
Don't let the world tell you how you're supposed to behave based on a totally fabricated idea of gender that has nothing
down
to do.
to biology and hormones and the social constructs and all of that has been made up.
Yeah.
Like be who you are.
You get to be you.
Yep.
Okay, I think that's a good note for us to end on. Ashlyn, if we are in the state of North Carolina and looking for a therapist, a trans-affirming therapist,
Yep.
or if we just want more information on this topic,
Yep.
where could we find more information?
So if you want to find me, I'm at therapywith_Ash on Instagram. And if you want to find the counseling center, that's ashtreecounselingcenter.com or Ashtree Counseling Center on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. If you're in the state of North Carolina, you can get a consultation with us and get set up with counseling. But even if you're outside of the state, we'll have a blog post on this topic with more resources, more learning materials, information about communities that you can plug into.
Links to the communities that we
Exactly.
mentioned in this episode. Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your time.
And we'll see you next time on I Married Your Therapist.